Today, we're diving into the real triggers of the French Revolution. We're going to break down the powder keg of 1789, moving through the reality on the ground, a society divided, the royal debt crisis, famine and the bread, and finally, the people's grievances. All right, let's jump right in. So Arthur Young, an English traveler touring France in the 1780s, noted this incredibly chilling encounter. He met a peasant woman on the road, and he described her as having a figure so bent and a face so furrowed and hardened by labor that she literally looked 60 or 70 years old. She was only 28. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what kind of system ages a person so violently? Let's start with Section 1, the reality on the ground. Young witnessed this absolutely unbelievable juxtaposition. Just picture it. You're walking through the countryside, and you're seeing these mud houses with zero windows, kids playing barefoot in literal rags. And then you take a short carriage ride over to the royal palace at Versailles. Bam! You are hit with the absolute luxury and the careless indifference of the monarchy. It's like two entirely different universes, just existing side by side. And a perfect symbol of this daily injustice was something called the Capitaneries. These were massive royal hunting grounds where droves of wild boars and deer just roamed totally free, completely destroying and eating the peasants' crops. And get this, peasants were legally forbidden from weeding or mowing their own fields early. Why? Just so they wouldn't disturb the young partridges meant for the king's sport. Seriously, you essentially had to stand there and watch a wild boar eat your family's survival rations, knowing full well you'd face the galleys if you dared harm His Majesty's favorite target practice. It's wild. Which brings us to Section 2, a society divided. France was sitting on a massive demographic time bomb. The Third Estate, which was basically everyone from the poorest peasant all the way up to the wealthiest urban merchant, comprised an overwhelming 98% of the population. 98%! Yet they were utterly dominated by that remaining tiny 2% made up of the clergy and the nobility. So, despite making up virtually the entire country, this 98% majority was heavily marginalized. They owned just 35% of the land. They were almost entirely dependent on wealthy landlords just to survive, all while simultaneously shouldering the vast majority of the nation's financial burdens. When you lay out the facts, the systemic injustice is just mathematically undeniable. The Third Estate was suffocating under heavy burdens. We're talking the talia, direct tax, church tithes, and these heavy feudal dues paid to local lords. Meanwhile, the First and Second Estates, they're enjoying vast wealth, extensive land, and sweeping tax exemptions. There was actually a French maxim at the time that bluntly put it like this: the nobles fight, the clergy pray, and the people pay. Let's zoom out a bit for Section 3, the royal debt crisis. The French crown wasn't just struggling here, it was completely drowning. 1.3 billion livres. That is the staggering amount the French government spent on the American War of Independence alone. Just to put that into perspective, that single intervention cost more than double the crown's entire annual revenue. You add that to the 7 Years' War, which cost another 1.8 billion livres, and the monarchy was basically trapped, trying to fund global warfare with the completely archaic economy.
And the tax collection system itself? It was remarkably inefficient. They used this system called tax farming, where private groups collected fixed amounts and just kept any excess for themselves, which completely starved the government of actual revenue. Combine that with the wealthy nobility's stubborn outright refusal to be taxed, even as the whole nation faced bankruptcy, and the government literally had no way to pay its debts. They ended up facing impossible interest rates from lenders, twice as high as Britain's, just spiraling into this uncontrollable deficit.
Now, let's look at Section 4, famine and the bread. It is fascinating and terrifying to see how these events compound into a perfect storm. Back in the late 1760s, fluctuating harvests plunged rural villages into real uncertainty. Fast forward to 1787, and because agricultural workers were the primary consumers, this instability caused a massive crash in the silk and linen industries. And then this industrial crash collides with widespread crop failures in 1788, which, crazy enough, might have been triggered by an Icelandic volcanic eruption. All of this basically brings the French economy to a grinding halt. The human cost of these systemic failures eventually culminated in a sudden 88% spike in the price of bread in 1789. Now, the crown's financial crisis might have seemed a bit abstract to your average peasant, but the price of bread? That was a daily matter of life and death. Almost overnight, a national debt issue transformed into a literal starvation crisis. Because agriculture fueled 75% of domestic production, poor harvests didn't just mean less food on the table. They triggered a severe industrial crisis and a devastating 25% fall in real wages. I mean, think about that math for a second. The exact moment bread prices spiked by 88%, the wages needed to actually buy that bread dropped by a quarter. It was basically a mathematical guarantee for rioting and absolute desperation. This takes us to our final part, Section 5, the People's Grievances. So, in a pretty desperate bid to manage all this unrest, King Louis XVI convened the Estates General in 1789. And right before this, he requested cahiers de doléances. These were formal lists of grievances and reform suggestions drawn up by each of the three estates. It was a totally unprecedented move. For the very first time, the king was actually asking the people how they wanted the country fixed. And let me tell you, the Third Estate did not hold back. They demanded highly specific structural reforms. They wanted an end to tax privileges, an end to the crushing tile tax. They even demanded the destruction of the nobles' dovecotes, literally because state-sponsored pigeons were eating their seeds during planting season. But most crucially, they wanted a fair voting system by head rather than by estate to ensure their 98% majority would actually carry some weight. But you know what's truly fascinating here? It's what the Second Estate, the nobility, wrote. Even the Ancien regime was losing support among its own beneficiaries. A massive 89% of the Second Estate's cahiers indicated a liberal willingness to just give up their financial privileges. Influenced heavily by the Enlightenment, the elite themselves were starting to recognize that the system was entirely unsustainable. Which brings us to the ultimate reckoning. The simple act of writing these grievances forced the French people to articulate their misery, and more importantly, to realize their collective power. By the time the Estates General actually met, expectations were just so incredibly high that a return to the old ways was absolutely impossible. So I'll leave you with this question. When a profoundly unequal system finally asks the oppressed for their opinions, can it ever survive the answer? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.